This is the Hard Thing Podcast. Today, we are overcoming average. Welcome back to another episode of the Hard Thing Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Lewis, and this is the podcast that helps you improve your life, specifically by doing hard things. We're here to help you overcome the obstacles, trials, and challenges facing you in your life right now, and learn from that skills with which you can move forward and progress in every other aspect of your life and face future obstacles as well. We have an awesome show for you guys today, but before we get to that, let me tell you a couple of announcements. First of all, I'd like to invite you guys to go over to patreon.com/thehardthingpodcast. There you can find bonus content that you don't get anywhere else, not even on Instagram at The Hard Thing Podcast. There you can sign up to be a patron to get discounts on merchandise. You can interact with guests and other things, but you also get free content. So go to patreon.com/thehardthingpodcast, support the podcast, but also get some extra content along the way. Next, I'd like to invite you guys to go to OURrescue.org. They are a nonprofit organization that goes undercover to rescue kids from sex trafficking. And while you're there, all I want you to do is learn about the giant problem of sex trafficking. It's huge. Millions of people every year are enslaved in sex trafficking. And Operation Underground Railroad, which is this company, they actually go undercover. They rescue these people, specifically kids, and they put them in aftercare homes where basically their life is turned upside down. They're no longer being held in slavery, but instead they have prospects, they have a future, they have hope, they have freedom. So if you want to help rescue kids who are enslaved, go to OURrescue.org and just learn what they're all about. That's the biggest thing you can do right now. If you have some money, go ahead and donate. If you don't have any, just learn it. Make sure you tell your friends that this is a big problem and we need as many people as possible to know about it so we can stop it. Now, let me tell you about today's guest. Today I have the awesome opportunity to talk to Michael Easter. He is the author of the new book, Comfort Crisis, which I'm reading right now, and it is quite literally fantastic and amazing. I'll tell Michael this on the show, but within the first few days of reading it, I started making some changes that might have made my wife a little bit upset with me, but we don't mind that because this is a book that changes your lives. Also, he is a professor at UNLV, and he used to be, I don't think he is anymore, a contributing editor at Men's Health magazine. I'd also classify him as an adventurer and explorer. He's an adventurer journalist, you could say. I'm probably not doing it justice. He's way more cooler than I can describe him as. So let me just give you my conversation with Michael Easter. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Michael. I am very excited to have you on the Hard Thing Podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm really looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, me too. Before we hop into all the juicy bits of your story, let's ask the question that I ask every single guest. Michael, what's the hardest thing you've ever done?
That is a good question. So I worked at Men's Health magazine for a lot of years. So I got sent in some pretty extreme gyms and things like that. Done some work for outside. And for this book, I spent, a month in the Arctic backcountry. But while those things were hard, the hardest thing I've ever had to do is get sober. So I'm 7 years sober now about. And, back in the day, I come from this long line. I put it in the book, a long line of men who seem to hum on booze, bedlam, and bullshit. And this is just like our DNA. We're wild dudes. And I was kind of following that same path. And I don't know, had to make some changes. And those changes were not easy. I'll tell you that much. When you drink like me, it kind of became totally what I was used to, right? It fixed all my problems, made me feel comfortable in my own skin, made life easier for me. And when I took that away, all of a sudden life became hard. So that was definitely the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Yeah.
Yeah. I really love how in the book you don't necessarily start off with this experience, but within the first chapter or two chapters, you mention how you've had to make this really big change because it is an all-encompassing change in your life. And for the audience, the sake of the audience, could you share the moment or the experience in which you decided to actually make that change?
Yeah, sure. So you kind of need some background that like, I'm the type of person where I could never just have one drink. Like that's just is an impossibility for me. Still boggles my mind that people can just do that. My favorite drink was always the second one. And when I would drink, like it would fix things for a while, right? But then when your favorite drink is the second one, it always ends in chaos, Like it's not like I was getting hammered and going and donating my time at homeless shelters and reading classic works. Like you're just raising hell, right? I mean, that's what people do. So what would remind me of the question again? I was getting there. Oh, the moment.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. No worries.
So I tried to, quit drinking a bunch of times. It never really took because it's very hard. And I just had this one morning and I'd had a lot of mornings like this in my past where you wake up, it's like, you're not sure where your car is. Your house is a wreck. Like you're just a damn mess, like in every way. And for whatever reason, this one morning I had this like very clear, it was just a sense of clarity. And like, I could see that I could choose sort of the thing that I was used to, the easier path and continue drinking. But I could also see that if I kept doing that, I would eventually die early. Now, I didn't know if this meant like, oh, you're going to die next year or you're going to die in 50 years. I just knew that, years were going to be taken off my life. Or I could go on the rightward path, which was scary. I didn't know what it was going to be like, but I could try and sober up, and I knew it was going to be tough, and it was, but I was also sort of aware that, there's probably something there that's going to be a lot better in the long run. And there definitely was. Like once I got sober, like my life improved like across the board, like every single thing. I mean, there's not a single thing that I can't point to where I go, yeah, that got better, Yeah.
This is actually one thing that in reading your book really interested me. I wanted to ask, in all of your studies of doing hard things deliberately, did you ever come to an understanding of it, why exactly on that particular day you had that clarity and it stuck? Because like you said, you'd had many mornings where you woke up and you didn't, you had these thoughts, but why did that one work?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I could probably try and come up with an answer. I don't know if it'd be right. I think sometimes you just, it's like, oh, I don't know. Like, because I tried before and I'd had a lot of mornings like that where I'm like, okay, I'm never drinking again. And then by next weekend, it was like, oh, it'll be different this time. Like how many times in my life had I said, it'll be different this time? For whatever reason, that time it was like, this is the moment, And I think it's to quote one of my favorite bands, the Grateful Dead, once in a while you get shown the light in the strangest places if you look at it right. Who the hell knows why it was that morning? It just was, but I could see that this was different. This was an opportunity, and I took it. So
wow, that's fascinating. A lot of people usually kind of hit rock bottom, and I suppose that was a sort of a rock bottom, not necessarily the rock bottom in your case, but I think for the listeners, hopefully that gives them a lot of hope that, you don't necessarily have to, find yourself with no home, no prospects before you turn your life around. Maybe one day you just wake up and, hopefully it gets sooner than that, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think if you looked at my life on paper at the time, you would be like, oh, this person totally has it together, totally successful, that kind of thing. Like I was an editor at Men's Health. I owned my own house. My car was fine. I mean, like, all that stuff checked out, but internally I was a complete damn mess, and my behavior, what I was drinking was a mess too. So it was more, there's levels of bottoms, and it's like, how do we define bottom? Mine happened to be sort of like an emotional and spiritual and psychological bottom, although it wasn't necessarily one that where, like I said, on paper, it wasn't bottom, when you look at like stuff accumulation and titles and crap like that.
Yeah. I really like how you differentiate that because, and actually in a lot of your previous podcast appearances and in your book, you kind of differentiate between, this external sense of success and this internal sense of fulfillment, peace, wholeness. And we'll probably get into a lot of those, but you give various methods for reaching back into ourselves and finding those. But to help me understand the timeline, was this before or after your trip to Alaska for the 33 days in the Arctic?
So this was before.
Before.
Yeah. So this was, I'm 30, almost 35 now. This is when I was 28. So that essentially happens. Then I end up doing this trip with the character in the book named Donnie, who, for listeners, Donnie is a backcountry bow hunter and filmmaker, and he'll go like off the grid for months at a time into the world's most extreme places. And he makes these movies, and they're hard to describe, but I essentially describe them as like Planet Earth, but with hunting in them. Like they're very different than your standard, I don't know, hunting show on the Outdoor Channel. So I meet him. I do this story for Men's Health on him, and we hit it off, and he invites me up to the Arctic for more than a month. And I, it's one of those where I'm like, well, this is going to be out of my comfort zone, but let's do it. Let's explore this thing and see what happens.
When you decided to accompany him up to the Arctic, I know from your previous podcast appearances that you'd met him in Nevada. You'd gone on kind of it was like a 2-week or 1-week trip with him. And you were toying around with the idea of this book. Did you really solidify this idea of, pushing yourself into uncomfortable situations? And was that really what made you say, okay, you know what, this is going to be super hard, but I'll do it?
So I thought there was a book there, right? Because Nevada had given me an idea of that, and I had sort of dabbled with some of the themes that you find in the book in that original story. So I almost thought of it like, well, what if we were to take this article and really blow it out, and like really explore a lot of different avenues and give up? Because look, writing for magazines, you're constrained in word count. You're constrained by the voice and tone of the publication. You are constrained by what like 7 different editors think should be in this piece, right? So there's a lot of stuff where I'm like, man, I'd really like to touch on that. I'd really like to touch on that, but I couldn't. So I thought it could maybe be a book, but you don't really know, right?
Yeah.
So I figured I would try this Arctic thing and see if there was. And yeah, there was. I got a book out of it.
In publishing the book, was that something you kind of branched out away from the magazine to do with maybe outside publishers or things like that?
Yeah. So what happens is you have to, with books, you'll come up with a proposal, which is like this big 50-page document that like details every chapter and has a sample chapter and has like a marketing plan. It's essentially like a business plan, but for a book. And then you find an agent, which sounds super pretentious, but that's just how it works, right? Yeah. So then they go out and they kind of shop it around publishers, and then the publisher decides if they're going to buy it or not, more or less. Yeah.
So my next question, and obviously this follows the chronology of your book writing experience, I'm guessing. Before you have the manuscript or whatever, you are in Alaska. I forget the name of the town. And you're about to hop on this plane that you describe as being the size of a pack of gum. Mm-hmm. Most average people, and this is what this podcast is all about, finding the people who rise above average and figuring out how to get the rest of us, or at least those who choose to that point. Most people would chicken out. They would say, no, like, there's no way I'm going on this. So like, what made you actually do it when you could have said no?
I think that having gone through probably getting sober, it's like you realize that sometimes we are afraid of things before actually experiencing them. And once you get in that position, they're not that bad. And there's often, by facing your fears down, you often get a huge benefit from that, right? Like if I had chickened out on sobriety, I could be dead right now. And I'm not saying that lightly, Yeah. So I think by doing that, I'm like, I knew that I was probably going to learn something about myself. I knew that I was probably going to have a really interesting experience. Would it be dangerous? Yes. Could the plane have gone down? Yes. It happens all the time in Alaska. But at the same time, it's not like 1 out of every 2 planes goes down. It wasn't like a dumb decision. It was like, okay, I think the reward outweighs the risk here. I mean, that's what life is about, right? Trying to find that balance where the reward is going to outweigh the risk. And so, yeah, I'm like standing on that runway and it's super foggy. It's super windy. The plane is a little crappy tin can from like 1940. And I don't even like to fly in a 747,
Yeah.
but it's like you get in and then I find out when I get in the air, I'm like, this is actually kind of fun. This is actually really cool because you're like close to the ground. And, when the wind would gust and the thing gets blown a bunch of yards, it's just like, yeah, maybe you want to piss yourself, but, I'm here. We survived.
I guess sometimes in life, you have to go through moments where, metaphorically speaking, maybe you do kind of piss yourself, but you still get through it. You still do the job. You still make it to the finish line, regardless of pissing yourself. And that's another thing that I really liked about your story, because from what I understand, again, once you arrive in the Arctic, there's no opportunity to go home. So where most people would say, I want to be done, there's not that option. So you kind of have to persevere, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's like you can't tap out. I mean, we're in a lot of places where, planes couldn't even land. If something had gone wrong, it would have been like, okay, we have to figure out how to get from point A to point B where we can actually have a plane land. So once I was in,
Yeah.
which is also kind of nice, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I'm locked in here. So my option is figure out my shit.
Yeah.
The other option is there's not one.
Yeah.
Right.
Like death.
Yeah. So you gotta like, you are forced into sort of having these moments where it's like, you don't have a choice whether to keep going. So for example, like we had one night when we were walking back, we had to hike back to camp and it was like one of the coldest days. It was like -20. And we'd had like a river crossing. So our freaking boots are frozen and we had to do a bunch of miles back to camp before the sun gets down. And we're walking across this tundra and it's like, I want to quit. I mean, it's just complete exhaustion, right? We've been hiking around all day, but it's one of those where you can't quit. Like your option is like, okay, if I quit, then I'm going to spend the night out exposed and it's -20 right now. What do you think it's going to be at 2 a.m.? Like your only option is to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Now, of course, I wasn't out there alone, like I'm with some guys, but I think in modern life, and I'm not suggesting people go out and do these things that are, where they don't have an option to quit or whatever, because I think we can mimic these things in our everyday lives. But I am saying that like a lot of time nowadays, we have a safety net for everything. And, we have the option of making things easier and we tend to sort of take it. So this kind of, in the book, I talk about this idea of misogi, which is there's a guy whose name is Marcus Elliott. And he was a Harvard MD, but he decided he didn't want to be a doctor. He wanted to revolutionize sports science. That was his goal. And he like literally did it. He like integrated all this like data and biometrics and stuff. And he has contracts with the NBA and the NFL and all these different leagues. And he's super brilliant, super sciencey. But he also knows that not everything that improves humans can be measured necessarily. So to get to those qualities that are sort of immeasurable, he does this thing called misogi. And once a year, him and a group of people, a lot of them are, pro athletes at the highest level, will do one really hard task. And there's only 2 rules. One, it has to be really, really hard, which they define by having a true 50% chance of failure. And then number 2, you can't die. So they'll do things like one year they walked an 85-pound boulder under the Santa Barbara Channel for 5 miles. They've done things like, pick the farthest mountain you can see, and we're going to try and hike to it in a day or whatever. And what happens is, as humans evolved, we used to have to do hard things like all the time, these sort of challenging things. And we'd have to face these challenges. And this was often without a safety net. So they're trying to mimic that, because when we would do these hard challenges, we would often learn something about ourselves along the way, right? We didn't have a choice to sort of tap out or not to tap out. And these things were truly hard. We didn't get to self-select like, oh, my workout today is going to be 10 reps or 20 reps, right?
Right.
So they're trying to get to that, because once you get in that sort of middle ground where you're not sure if you're going to make it, and you are truly sort of flailing and unsure of what's going to happen here, you really have to dig deep physically, psychologically, spiritually, and sort of like find this thing that you probably didn't even know was there. But when you find that and you know it's there, you can take that back into your everyday life. And all of a sudden, the rest of life, you get a better perspective on it. Things seem easier. But it's really by doing, to the name of your podcast, doing the hard thing, right? Yeah. You get something out of that and learn something out of yourself, because we don't have to do the hard thing in modern life anymore. Mm-hmm. Everything has been engineered to be easy and effortless and unchallenging, which is great. That's why there's 8 billion people in the world today, why the majority of them have food and shelter. We are very successful as a species because we're good at engineering challenge out of our life. But by doing so, we've also lost something that sort of makes us human and tells us something about our potential. So by doing something hard, you can get that back.
Yeah. As you were saying this, kind of a thought came to my mind that I think maybe as kids, some of those instincts of just, feeling the need to do hard things is kind of still there. That's why kids play tag. That's why they're like, hey, let's see who can jump the highest. Or, I remember as a kid, I had this one friend, he was kind of a dick, but he was a good friend. We made this like obstacle course of just jumping from plywood to plywood in the backyard, and we'd time each other. I didn't find out until later that he was like purposefully messing with my time to make me think I was going slower, but I was like going way faster than him. But he was doing it to see how fast I could go. And I think, like you said, as we grow up, even not just, in the last decade, but as we grow up, this internal sense of there's this mountain in front of me and I want to climb it kind of goes away to, sitting in a room like this with computers like this and in a chair like this and not doing much,
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think something I talk about in the book, though, is that in 1990, I think that's true what you just said for kids generally, but you also see that in 1990 is when helicopter parenting starts. So all of a sudden, kids can't go out and do that kind of stuff. I used to do the same stuff.
Yeah.
We'd build forts in the woods. We would, build little bonfires when we weren't supposed to. We would run and, beat each other up, that kind of shit.
Yeah.
But in 1990, there was a bunch of really high profile kidnappings. And even though the kidnapping rate was not increasing, it was actually decreasing. Parents all of a sudden started freaking out, thinking their kid's going to get kidnapped if they let them go outside too much. So parents really start helicopter parenting their kids. They can't go outside as much. So they don't get in these moments where they challenge themselves and learn something about themselves. And this is largely why kids born after 1990 have such poor mental health rates, why they're, things like anxiety and depression are a lot higher in the generations born after 1990. Obviously, social media plays into it. There's a lot of factors, but that's one of the main factors, because if you've never really been challenged and learned how you perform when you're having been forced to do something hard, when you get in a situation that is challenging, all of a sudden that's really scary. And you just kind of want to stay within that pretty small comfort zone.
Right. One of the things that, one of the answers to the question, what's the hardest thing you ever done, that I've heard on the podcast a few times that has kind of surprised me, especially from who they've come from, has been being a parent. And I love that you bring up helicopter parents. And I want to kind of flip that and ask, how do you think it would look like to be a Misogi parent, if that's a term you could use? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the better person to ask this question to would be Marcus, because he has his kids go do some pretty cool stuff. But so I don't have kids, but I do think that taking your kids out into nature to do cool things with you at probably an earlier age than you think. I mean, obviously not like 4 years old where they can barely walk, but a lot of times people are like, well, I have to wait until my child is 17 to go backpacking with them. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? Kids used to be raised in nature and still are in many hunter-gatherer tribes, the ones that are still around. Like, kids do really well when they're outdoors and they can adapt quickly. I think what we have a view of kids is they're like these fragile made of glass creatures, and they're not. Like, they're going to be fine. And in fact, we also know that, I mean, just take one example, like one of the reasons why people who are younger, I think born after 95. No, what the data is it's when you compare people from 1950 to those born after 1990, the ones who are born after 1990 have a twofold increased risk of things like colon cancer and rectal cancer. The reason for that is kids in the 50s used to go outside and get dirty all the time. They would get their hands in dirt. They were always exposed to germs. So their body built up resistance to different germs, and it really improved their gut bacteria. Whereas kids today, they're inside and they're always getting their hands sanitized all day and like, oh, we can't let this kid get dirty at all. Well, their system has no defense against any incoming invader. So it tends to overreact against things that aren't really an invader, more or less. And this tends to cause systems to go haywire and cause diseases like different cancers and stomach problems, et cetera.
Wow, that's so fascinating. That's like a micro metaphor of the whole book. Everyone in society has been sanitized, maybe spiritually, mentally, emotionally. So that way, and I know on previous podcasts, you've talked about microaggressions and things like that. And looking at the state of society, it's kind of tragic seeing what little we as a society can deal with as far as challenges, trials, or obstacles. Thinking back over the last century, the greatest generation, they dealt with a Great Depression and then a World War. I shudder to think what might happen if something worse than everyone staying home happened in the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that's a good question. Like, I wonder myself, is it one where we're screwed, or is it like you throw people into these hard things and this sort of machinery gets kicked on where all of a sudden, granted, that would be bad if something like that happened, but I think we would learn something about ourselves, and we just don't have, these smaller things. You obviously don't want the thing that tells you something about yourself to be a war, right? But it's like, what can we engineer back into our lives to sort of mimic those benefits we used to get from the past, and doing things like having to do a rite of passage or something.
I really liked how you talked about rites of passage. I've heard on several other podcasts talking about that, specifically with men, how men don't become men. They have to pass tests, and they're brought into manhood by people, mentors, things like that. And if you were to look at society, maybe on individual scales, I guess better question, if you were to engineer a rite of passage that you would administer to yourself 20, 15, 10 years ago, what would you do for yourself?
It's a good question. Something outside that was like, took a lot of preparation and time, where you have to learn some skills that are going to benefit you. Because when you think about rites of passage today, like, I don't know what we really have. I think really the military is probably the only place that is putting that at scale. Because when you think about boot camp, like, the idea of rites of passage are that you are person A and you're great, but you don't have the tools that we need for you to really benefit society. Like, you're not quite ready. So we need you to turn into person B. And to get you there, we're going to put you through this hard trying thing that's going to teach you a lot about yourself and impart you some skills. So that's what the military does, right?
Right.
It's like, you get this recruit, you shave their head, and it's like, dude, you're going to boot camp, or you're going to selection. Yeah. They go through this hard thing. And then on the other side, they literally are a new person. And we signify that by, okay, if it's special forces selection, it's like, you have the Ranger tab, or you have the Green Beret, or whatever it is. There's some like line in the sand they cross, but we don't have that at a scale. So like, what, when I think of that, it's like, it would be something that did something similar, where there's like this line they had to cross. I mean, so I'm like, an example would be, I'm an Eagle Scout. Like, that shit was so easy.
Yeah.
Like, even that is like, we didn't even have, like, you do some basic merit badges, you get the thing, like, it's not that hard. You just have to be like persistent. We need I do think we would benefit from something, even if it's like an outward bound type thing, where it's like, right, hey, we're going to go just spend a month somewhere,
Yeah. That's really interesting. And freaking Eagle. That's one of the biggest lies I was taught as a kid. I'm from Utah, so you're probably very familiar with the Mormon culture and all that.
Yeah.
All the moms are like, the Eagle's going to be like the most important thing on your job application. Not once have I
Yeah.
ever, anyways. Yeah. Another kind of switching gears. One question that came up for me when we were talking about kind of, I guess the inevitability when you're put in that situation, when you went to Alaska, it was, the finish line was in 33 days. You couldn't move it closer or whatever. You had this, I guess, lack of choice, which really empowered you in the choices that you made. I wanted to ask your opinion. Do you think dealing with cancer, it can be considered a type of misogi?
Totally. Yeah. Because all of a sudden you focus on what your total focus in life changes, right? You just need to you got this one thing.
Yeah.
I would imagine. I mean, I'm sure different people deal with it different ways, but that's what I've heard. I talked to a guy about this who actually had cancer, and he was like, yeah, it sounds like kind of what I went through, where you got this focus, you're not sure if you're going to make it, but along the way, it really peeled away the extra layers of his life that weren't doing much for him. Right. So this guy in particular, it's like he went through this thing and he became a new person by going through it. Terrible way to figure that kind of shit out, but it was what it was. And he left his job, started his own thing, and he's much happier for it, So I think that there's different ways to interpret misogi for sure.
Wow. I brought that up in part because in having these conversations with people and specifically asking them, what's the hardest thing you've done? And usually it's the hardest thing you've done and successfully seen to the end or so forth. I've been trying to look for similarities between the people that have done these hard things. And one thing that I've noticed is that all of them with these hard things, they eventually get put themselves into kind of a position of inevitability. And as you brought up misogis, I think that term basically describes, obviously it has a little bit more information to it, but it describes that idea of, putting yourself in such a place that to fail is almost as hard as pushing through to the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want that moment where it's like, it leads to a perspective shift and you're just forced to sort of keep going. And what's the other option, Yeah.
Moving forward, so you're in Alaska 33 days. Obviously, this is not talking about everything that happened during those 33 days, but I'm really interested in, speaking of perspective shifts, how was it like when you came back to quote unquote civilization and the normal world again, quote unquote?
Yeah, way more grateful for everything we have. So, one of the first places we get to, we have to take those crappy planes back to the crappy little airport. But the crappy little airport did have hot running water. And this didn't even occur to me, right?
Right.
I'm just totally gross. Haven't showered in a month or whatever, go into the bathroom there and wash my hands. And it's oh, wait, the water's just coming out of a faucet. I didn't have to hike a mile and then hike it back up to have it. And then I put my hands under it and it's warm. And it was when that water hit my hands, it was like a child on Christmas. I mean, it was the most amazing thing ever. Right.
Yeah.
But this also, this experience, colored my life for a long time after. So normally people think that, taking a flight sucks because you're in this cramped seat and it's either too hot or too cold and whatever. It's well, after Alaska, it's I was just so glad to be sitting on an actual chair. I've been sitting on the ground. And the fact that it's temperature controlled is amazing. The fact that I could just hit a button and someone would bring me a hot coffee was amazing. And I think we forget all of the amazing things that we have in our life, all these advances. And there's a good reason for that. There's this psychological idea. It's called prevalence-induced concept change. You can just think about it as this creep phenomenon where we don't have the ability to sort of look back 200, 2000, 2 million years and be man, I have it pretty good in the grand scheme of time and space. We sort of just look for problems and we don't really appreciate what we have. And so I think by doing something like a Musogi, getting outdoors more, doing something hard, you sort of realize how good you have it. That's what definitely happened for me. I was definitely complaining less. I was way hard to rattle. Just like most of the problems that a lot of us have nowadays. And I'm not suggesting that, the world doesn't have problems that we need to fix and that people don't have real problems. But I think a lot of the problems that consume the mind of the average person are basically sort of flippant first world problems. And that's what we obsess about. And that is what ruins our days, are these like little stupid things that don't matter in the grand scheme of time and space, and that gets kind of reset when you leave that world for a while.
Was there, and this is a totally, I guess, shot in the dark kind of question. Was there any particular moment in which, after coming back from Alaska, maybe 6-7 months, a year after, that you kind of realized like, hey, I think I might be slipping into kind of pre-Alaska tendencies. I might need to change some things. Did that happen for you at all?
Yes, there was definitely a moment. I'm pretty sure it was after Alaska. I think it was after Alaska. Yeah, my wife and I, we went to a movie, and so this was like right before the pandemic, and we go to this movie theater, and it's one of those where like I have like this massive diet soda. We've got popcorn, and like the seats are literally heated and reclining. Like this is a pimped out movie theater, but it's totally empty. And this old guy comes, and out of 100 chairs, he sits next to me. And I'm like, sir, why did you choose that seat? And he's like, oh, I just like the end in the middle, And I'm like, you're insane. But I'm like, this like actually really irritated me. Right. Yeah. I'm like, what is up with this dude? And like, it sort of like, it like halfway ruined my movie experience. And then afterwards, my wife is like, you're an asshole. And I'm like, you know what? You are right. You are 100% right. I'm watching a freaking movie, and like, I'm upset because some person sat within like 3 feet. Like, what am I talking about? You know what I mean? And so sometimes, those things this is why it's important to do stuff relatively regularly,
Also, that's why it's important to have people around you that can call you on your crap.
Yes.
And really, just say that kind of stuff to your face. Because one of the things that a lot of the people I talk to have in common is that they always have a team around them, a tribe, just a community of people that can do similar things and say like, hey, you're not living up to your potential. So that's also super important.
Yeah, I agree. And I definitely will say, look, I had like way more moments that were the opposite of that than I did that one, Like I had this one where a lady was at like a CVS or a Walgreens or a place like that. And I have like, I'm just like getting a pack of gum or something. She has all this crap and she's checking out. There's only one check clerk, right? And she like checks all her stuff. And then she's like, oh, hold on. Wait a minute. And she walks to the back of the store and is like continuing her shopping as I'm like waiting, right? And at first I'm like, is this lady serious? And then I'm like, you know what? Like, I don't know what she's buying. Maybe she needed like medicine for her kid or like I'm just going to choose to believe that she is getting and doing something that is way more important than what I'm doing. Cause the reality is like, I wasn't in a rush. Right. I'm getting gum, so it's kind of like, okay, well, yeah, it's fine. And then because I didn't react in such a way that was like super negative, I had a lot better rest of my day.
Yeah, I love it. And that actually reminds me of how in the book you started off by saying, along with the clarity of I need to get sober or else I'm going to die early, came the realization that, the world doesn't revolve around me. And I think that, I'm guessing on an evolutionary scale, each of us are programmed for that, for our own survival. But in a weird way, if we can temper that a little bit, it also helps us survive a little bit more by integrating us into society better. So I think it's probably, we're kind of vacillating on that. Like, yes, need to focus on me, improve my spiritual, physical, emotional health. I also need to give people a break and things like that. So that kind of interests me. going back to Alaska, you mentioned that it it didn't just challenge you physically, but it also challenged you emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Can you give us kind of a brief summary or synopsis, or I guess whatever you want to talk about each one of those, each aspect?
Yeah. So, yeah, I'll talk about two things. One of them is that, you know, psychologically, when you're hunting this herd of caribou we're hunting, you're waiting for them to come through. So you're anticipating that you're in a good spot. And the first handful of days, these caribou did not want to come through. So we're like sitting on this hill, just waiting. Of course, I don't have service. Like I couldn't get a bar of service within 100 miles. My phone is useless. I didn't bring stuff.
Right.
So I'm like so bored, right? And I hadn't really experienced boredom like that for a long time, because boredom is something that we can fix really, really easily today. We have a million different ways to quell our boredom: cell phones, Netflix, computer. I'm going to Amazon Prime some stuff on Prime Day, man, just load up on garbage.
Yeah.
And up there, you don't have those easy escapes. It turns out that boredom is like this evolutionary discomfort that essentially just tells us, hey, whatever you're doing right now, it's not a good return on your time invested. So as we evolve, this could be like the situation I was in. A hunt was not working out, but you still need food, dude. So go find some berries, go fish, go gather, go figure out something else. So it often pushed us into doing something that improved our life and our, standing in life. And nowadays we have these really easy escapes from it. We don't necessarily have to do something that improves our life, right? It's like all these machines have kind of hacked this evolutionary hardware and sort of taken control of it. So as I'm up there, like I had moments where I would just stare at nature. I had some where I'd be like reading labels on my Cliff Bars, but I had others where I'm like coming up with interesting ideas. I'm writing some of my book. I'm learning new stuff. I'm having good conversations with people, and no one's bringing out their cell phone. Right. So I think the message in the book is like, boredom is a good thing. It can push you into interesting situations, creative ideas. But so often now, anytime we feel it, we just take the easiest way out. And by sort of removing ourselves from all the media in our life, I think we can definitely experience some benefits for sure. And, I think you see a lot of language around how, you need to use your phone less. Everyone get off your phone. That's great. It's obvious. We've all heard that. But also when people stop using their phone, they will often go, well, what do I do now? And they watch Netflix. They get on the computer. It's the same thing. Your brain doesn't know the difference. So I kind of advocate in the book that we need moments of boredom. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but on the other side of that, you'll find something more interesting than you will find on Twitter or whatever website you read. So that was kind of a psychological one that was interesting. Sort of emotional and spiritual is that like I was not a hunter before I got up there.
Yeah.
I ate meat like almost every day. So it's not like I was anti-hunting, but I didn't really want to be the person behind the gun or the bow or whatever. And I think the reason for that is because the way that we view death in the West in particular is like, we don't want to be aware of it. Right.
Yeah.
So even like our funeral systems are very sanitized. It's like, we kind of dress the person to look as youthful as possible. You look at them for an hour at a viewing and it's in the ground and you're told to take your mind off it. Right.
Yeah.
And something like our food system, it's like our meat does not look like it came from an animal. And we use these words for the cuts that are like, it doesn't indicate. Yes, exactly. But through hunting, like all of a sudden I had to reinsert myself into the life cycle. And that made me more aware of the fact that for life to go on, we need to have death in the world. Like that's just how it goes, whether that's a plant dying or an animal dying. If you're going to live on, something has to die because you got to eat something, right? But it also made me sort of more aware of my own mortality. So in the book, like I chased this idea down and I ended up traveling to Bhutan. Bhutan is interesting because it is one of the least developed nations on earth, but it's also one of the one of the happiest. And part of the reason for this, there's a handful of reasons. But one of them is that they are very death aware, I guess you could say. Like, people in Bhutan are told to think about their death at least once a day. Like, a lot of their cultural stuff revolves around death. Funerals are very different. They're like a big freaking party that lasts 21 days, more or less. And I talked to a guy who's really high up in the Buddhist faith about this. And he basically explained it like, look, when you realize that one day you are going to die, your mind tends to center on that which actually matters. You become happier because you start making decisions on and making choices that are actually going to impact your life. You all of a sudden don't care as much about these first world problems that we have. It puts those in perspective. You have more compassion, because if like some person is, like that lady in front of me at the CVS, if I'm like, oh, I'm going to die one day, she's going to die one day, I'm not going to be like, you're a terrible person, right? Yeah. Just like, oh yeah, take your time, lady. Like, I'm fine. So it tends to make people happier and have them have better life decisions. And I definitely think it works.
I find this really interesting because I don't think Bhutan is alone in this kind of, well, in some of the practices, but in the general theme. In Roman society, the soldiers used to have a saying, you've probably heard of this, memento mori, which basically means remember death. And they had tokens to remind them of death, like skulls or things like that. Mm-hmm. And it was this idea of like, hey, you're going to die, so you better live right now. And, listening to your podcast, reading your book has kind of ruined me in some ways these last few days. I got it on Sunday. It's been like, hey, Justin, you should start thinking about death a little bit more, because it's something personally that I haven't necessarily confronted. I haven't, faced a lot of death in my life, in my close personal circles. Mm-hmm. It's definitely something that is a fear to me, and it gave me a little bit of hope of like, hey, you can come to terms with it and find some measure of joy now. Hopefully live your life better now, be better to your wife, your parents, your siblings, your friends. And live in these certain ways. And that's not the only way that your book has definitely changed things here. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think you stop putting stuff off, because you're like, it's one of these guys told me, he's like, you got to remember, death can come at any time, like any time. And that's true. It's like, I had a crazy experience in Bhutan where at the end of the trip, I was like going up to this monastery. It takes like a 5-mile hike to get up there. It's really beautiful. It's like this famous, its nickname is the Tiger's Nest. You can Google it and see photos. But after I'm done seeing this, like, my driver comes up to me and he's like, hey, someone's sick. And like, whatever, I run over and there's this Buddhist monk who's down on the ground. There's people surrounding him. No one knows CPR. So I just start doing CPR on this dude. And these 2 doctors from Hong Kong were actually down the trail, and they came up. And I kept doing CPR because they were really small and this guy was 200 pounds. So it made sense. And we tried to resuscitate this guy for like 20 minutes, tried to call in a helicopter, but we're like on these cliffs, the helicopter couldn't land. And this guy ended up dying. And we are 5 miles up, like 10,000 feet above sea level on a super steep trail. Like, this guy had walked this entire thing. This is not a guy who's like in the memory care center of a old folks home, right? He's probably like 60 and obviously very healthy, and like just something happened and the guy ended up passing away. And this was like the day before I had one of these monks be like, death can come at any time. Remember that. And then that happens. And it was like, oh, wow. Whoa, so that's definitely changed my behavior. I'm not like sitting around going, well, I'll do that when I retire, or, I'll take this shitty job I don't want to take, like this little gig because blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, just like figure out what's important to you and do that.
Right.
Obviously within reason, we have to make an income, but like, I think that people sometimes become a slave to their bank account and like having all these bills and like stuff that like, are you really going to care if you drove a used Subaru instead of a brand new Audi on your deathbed? Like, no, you're not,
Best way I heard it, you never see a U-Haul going behind a mortuary car. What are those called? Gosh, what are those called? Anyways,
Oh
the cars,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
the cars with the
That's
dead
great.
bodies. So that's not
Yeah.
mine. But speaking of, I guess, the here and now and things that have changed your life, I want to talk about the things that you've started implementing in your life to kind of
Hmm.
see those changes, start doing those micro hard things, macro hard things, however you want to describe it. What are some things, and even Misogis, if you feel so inclined, what are some things that you've started to apply that you've actually seen major differences?
Yeah. So I'll just start rapid firing off. I do a Masogi every year. Um, my most recent one, and one of the guidelines of Masogi is that you're not supposed to like advertise it and brag
Sure.
about it, but for the sake of information and telling people like how to think about it, I had never run more than 16 miles. And so I was thinking, okay, I'll go do like some trail run out in the desert. And it's like, could I do 32? And I was like, yeah, I maybe could probably do 32, but doing 48, triple that. I was like, oh dude, I don't know if I can do that. But I did. And I had this moment where I was like, I'm going to quit. Like I did it 4 laps of 12 miles out on this trail in Red Rock Canyon. And, that third lap, I was like, okay, we're hanging up the shoes after this one. But for whatever reason, after 3, I was like, let's go explore this thing. Let's see if there's a 4. What's the worst that can happen? I have to like just walk back, whatever. And I did it. And I can tell you, I got a lot out of it. I spend a lot more time in nature. So there's a section in the book where I talk about the specific doses of nature that we need to be happier, less stress, more focused, more productive. There's so many benefits, and we now spend 95% of our time indoors. So I live at the edge of the desert, so I'm out there usually every day. I'm just walking for a little while. I also ruck a lot more. So my training before I had started reading this book is like I was at Men's Health. So a lot of it was like gym stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about the modern gym, like we've engineered it to be as comfortable as possible, right? Like, yes, exercise is uncomfortable, but the way we do it in a gym is comfortable.
Little pads on those machines and such.
Yes, little pads on the machine. The weights are perfectly balanced.
Mm-hmm.
We lift them a predetermined number of times. And then when we're done, it's like, I'm going to go to the smoothie bar, that type of thing, right? So, but when you look at why the human body evolved the way it did and why we're built the way we are, we're basically good at 2 things. We are good at running long distances slowly in the heat. We would do this in order to hunt animals. So every other animal is faster than us. They can sprint, but they overheat in the heat. So we would sort of chase them down. And after like 10, 20 miles, they would have overheated and we could spear them. And then we would have to carry them back. So that's the second thing we're good at. We're the only animal that can efficiently carry weight for distance. A lot of people jog, run slowly, right? But not many people carry for a workout. And in fact, the only people that do are usually special forces soldiers, because that's like the main part of their training is rucking, having to carry heavy loads across rough terrain. And it's a great form of exercise because you're getting cardio, you're also getting strength, you're getting outdoors usually, and the injury rate is like way lower than running. So running has a super high injury rate. It's anywhere from 20 to 70%. And I'm saying that as someone who likes to run, but rucking is ticks off a lot of boxes and it's really good for people. So I also met with researchers and doctors at the Mayo Clinic who are prescribing rucking to a lot of their patients now that they've learned about it. So those are a few things. I think trying to find boredom. I do that by walking out in the desert without my phone, so I'm getting a couple birds with one stone. When I do your typical weight training stuff, I do it in my garage, so in the winter, it's going to be colder than I want. In the summer, it's going to be way hotter than I want. It's like in the hundreds in there now. And it sucks the first couple of weeks of that, but your body eventually adapts. And it turns out we actually get some benefits by becoming adapted to too cold or too hot. Whereas now most people just live at 72 degrees,
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that. As I was reading the book, my wife and I just moved into this new place and, it has the nice thermostat on your phone type feature. And as I'm reading this, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, he's right. So I turned the thermostat off just to, let whatever's outside kind of be inside. And And later that night, my wife's like, "You turn it off. What's wrong with you?" And she's all like mad at me. So listeners, beware. This book will change many things.
But you can tell her to be mad at me.
I will. Thank you so much, Michael, for being on the show. I don't want to take up more time than you've given me. Actually, as far as action items go, I think those four things you mentioned, five. So working out in adaptive states were really good. So do a misogi, spend more time in nature, go rucking, find boredom, and work out or try and adapt yourself to more extreme temperatures, I guess you could say.
And remember, you're going to die.
Yeah, remember, you're going to die. Hopefully you shouldn't, though, because that's rule number 2, no dying, right?
Yeah, just don't die on misogi.
Yeah, exactly.
Die at 80 or 90 with some rad stories about misogi.
All right. But how can people reach out to you, support you, see what's going on with you?
Yeah, so the book is called The Comfort Crisis, and it is available wherever books are sold. I got a website. It's eastermichael.com, and I'm on Instagram quite a bit. I do a lot of stuff there. It's Michael_Easter. So that's kind of the social platform I use. I try not to use too many of them. So, but that's my one.
Perfect. I will get all those up in the show notes. Audience, seriously, go and get the book, because I'm reading it right now. I got it 2 days ago, and it's been, as you can already tell, it started having changes on my life and things that I'm thinking about. I'm probably going to try and do a ruck this Saturday. That's another thing that
nice.
Definitely. Well, you talked about it, and I actually just tore my ACL. So walking is kind of like the only cardio.
Yeah.
So I'm like, you know what? Ruck sounds super doable. And so anyways.
Yeah. Let me know how it goes. I'm sure it'll be good.
So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode. I told you that it was going to be awesome, and frankly, Michael did not disappoint whatsoever. It was an awesome conversation, and he's an awesome guest. Just his whole story is really amazing. It's kind of the thing that as young boys you kind of imagine and dream of being able to do, and he actually did it. And so I'd like to challenge each and every one of us to go and do these misogis. You know, they don't have to be 33 days in the Alaskan bush, but maybe tundra would be a better way to say it. But definitely go and start having these adventures. Put yourself to the test. You know, put yourself through these rites of passage. Make yourself hardier by doing these hard things. And by doing that, you'll find yourself happier. You'll find yourself having more fulfillment, because the smaller things won't bother you, and you'll be better able to cope with the bigger things. I'd also just like to encourage you guys to reach out to Michael on Instagram and just say thank you for coming on the show. It was an amazing episode, and reach out to him. Tell him how much you enjoyed his show, and if possible, go get the book Comfort Crisis. It's an amazing book, and honestly, I think it's something that most of America needs to hear right now, and we need to practice on improving, because if you think about it, up until probably the 1900s, maybe a little bit before, I'd say the Industrial Revolution, up until the Industrial Revolution, the whole world as a whole was kind of in this state of, how can you say, lacking, right? In almost every instance, you're lacking, and you're trying to catch up, right? But now we're in this state of overabundance, and maybe overabundance in the wrong ways. So that way, all these trends of minimalism and, you know, self-induced hardships, these things are coming around, and they're how we get back to this kind of equilibrium of having just enough to make us grow, but also just enough to survive. So go ahead and go get the Comfort Crisis. Reach out to Michael on his Instagram or his website. Just let him know how much you enjoyed the podcast. And I just want to thank you guys so much for listening to the show. I really appreciate you guys coming back every Monday. You guys are the Hard Thing Podcast. I may be the voice, but you guys are the podcast. So just thank you so much. If you get a moment, leave a rating or review, and share your thoughts of the podcast so other people know. Be honest, but definitely share your thoughts and help other people understand what the podcast is all about, so they can share in its message. But go out, do these hard things, do the action items. You know, go do a misogi, go do a ruck. I'm planning on doing a ruck soon. Last but not least, though, I just want to invite you guys to go out and do a hard thing. Do some hard things. Do many hard things. Do all the hard things, you know. Do some hard things, because every hard thing will make you better able to overcome average.